Hi, my name is Sean Desilets. I'll be giving the Matthew lecture in this kind of strange format. This first slide here presents a picture of me so that you'll have some sense of who's talking to you. That's me there. As you can see, and my email address is there should you have any questions or thoughts. Maybe by way of introducing myself, I can say that I am not a New Testament scholar by any stretch of the imagination. My qualifications for giving this lecture are that I did extensive research on Matthew as I was working on a book chapter about the film The Gospel According to St. Matthew by Pier Paolo Pasolini. Here's a picture of Pasolini along with a picture of the guy who played Jesus. His name was Enrico Razzacqui. I wanted to tell you, just as a way to kind of get started, a story about how Pasolini came to make a film of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Pasolini was a famous gay atheist communist, kind of a rebel in Italian culture, an intellectual rebel. And at this time, this was in the 1960s. The film is from 1965, if I remember correctly. There was kind of a new warming of relations between various Italian leftists and the Catholic Church. And as part of these kind of overtures, Pasolini was invited to Assisi. Looking at the traffic outside of his hotel room, he picked up a copy of the Bible that was in his hotel room, and he read the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And he was so moved by it that he vowed to make a film of it. He did make an extremely faithful film adaptation, insofar as it's possible to make a faithful adaptation of a text in film. And it was one of his most successful and highly acclaimed films. In fact, it's one of the very few films that the Catholic Church accepts as a sort of quasi-canonical or acceptable representation of Jesus's life. So one reason I wanted to present this story is that a lot of the distinctions or barriers that it looks to some people that Matthew is setting up and supporting in his gospel break down in the face of careful attention to the text of the gospel and the context in which it was made. And that's going to be sort of the theme for this text, or for this conversation, for this discussion. So I wanted to start with you, the kind of allegedly clear barrier between, or the apparently clear barrier between the rebel atheist Pier Paolo Pasolini and the obviously not atheistic or particularly rebellious Catholic Church, and also maybe a little bit of a barrier between representation, right? This is a person dressed in the costume of Jesus. The image on the right is the image of a person dressed in the costume of Jesus, clearly participating in an artwork. And it might be a useful way to think about Gospels in general, to think about how they choose to represent Jesus and Jesus's life. So the first distinction that I want to talk about, a close reading and a careful reading of Matthew, breaking down a little bit, is the distinction between religion and politics. It's a pretty strongly held idea in American society, but a pretty much non-existent one in Roman society. And so one of the things we'll do here is to kind of go back for a minute to the end of the last text we studied, the Aeneid, and think about how its conclusion and how the uptake, really how its existence to begin with, is part of a process of ascribing deity to rulership. And that brings us back to where we were before the combination of plague and the break concluded our previous conversations. That is to say, Aeneas killing Turnus. It's a painting by Aurelio Milani of that event. And you can see Aeneas's foot there on the throat of Turnus. as you might imagine, this image kind of represents the way a lot of people felt throughout the Roman Empire um, during its time. It was and we see this in Virgil, right? A very triumphalist um, sort of empire, very excited and very aware of its own achievements and very interested in um, maintaining its control over what was a quite vast stretch of land. So this will give you kind of a state of the extent of the Roman Empire at this point. We saw a version of this map, Professor Vaheli. Um, there's Rome. You can see an arrow pointing to Rome there in the middle of Italy. And then if you looked way to the east, you can see where Jesus was born and moved around during his lifetime on the very first third of the first century. And then you can see a picture, you can see also an arrow indicating Antioch, which is in Syria, where probably the community that ended up producing the gospel according to Matthew operated. And so you can also see those little purple squares, as you can see on the legend, are bases for Roman legionnaires whose job, I suspect, was to maintain the empire. And you can see the cluster of them over there in that distant part of the world we think of as the Middle East now. And that was probably because far-flung parts of the empire like that required considerable military force to control in under certain circumstances at any rate. You had to be prepared for that anyway. Um, and although the dominance of the Roman Empire and the strength of the Roman Empire is very well documented in texts like the Aeneid, there were sources of trouble or sources of resistance. I mean, Professor Vaheli also mentioned the remarkable movement of wealth from the various other parts of the empire to Rome. And that yielded, there's discussion about this, nobody knows exactly how bad it was, but substantial economic inequality and very substantial poverty. And that was a factor in some of these resistances. Another factor was that Rome was famous for being very good at integrating other cultural traditions into its own tradition. Maybe polytheism is particularly good for that. I don't know, but as it conquered these places, it was able to integrate their gods, their languages, or at least allow lots of allow people who were conquered people to hold on to a lot of their cultural traditions. And even for the Jews, who were a lot different from the Romans, there was not a lot of explicit anti-Semitism, but there was a sense that Jews were a very different kind of people, and that they believed in a center of authority which was radically different from the Roman center of authority. And this was always a source of unease for Roman emperors, until, of course, the Roman Empire itself adopted Christianity under Constantine the Great, but that wasn't until the 4th century. These difficulties erupted into several uprisings on the part of Jewish people in the greater Jerusalem area. It's kind of the in Judea, the sort of home of the largest Jewish populations in the Roman Empire, although there were Jews scattered throughout the Roman Empire, and that was going to make a big difference to the spread of Christianity over time. Eventually, this chart sort of shows the progression of the emperors, the years associated with them. You can see the Aeneid composed somewhere around 29 to 19 BCE. Jesus' birth around 4 BCE. People guess that because Herod died in 4 BCE. I think people have that fairly well established, and that comes up in the Bibles, in the Bible, right in the New Testament, in the accounts of Jesus's movements in Matthew. In fact, and then you get this series of other emperors over this time. There was another uprising, this is not on the chart, but under Caligula, for example, Caligula insisted on, Caligula, if you can see from his 4-year rule, I mean his 4-year rule as emperor, not super successful. And one of his failures was that his narcissism was very dangerous, and he insisted on having, this is one of the things he did, he insisted on having a statue of himself erected in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, where, of course, well, you may or may not know, graven images were not a good thing, or not consistent with what Jews expected to find in their places of worship, in their synagogues. So that caused a considerable uprising until Caligula and his forces decided to relent. You can see Paul, the Saint Paul, who wrote some other books, a bunch of the letters in the New Testament, was operating around 41 to 54 CE. The earliest books in the New Testament are actually Paul's letters, which were composed in the period while he was running around, not running around, although I'm sure he did a good deal of running, moving around, establishing various, I call them ecclesia here. Sometimes that's translated as church, but for reasons that I'll get to in a minute, it's not perfectly accurate to describe any early Jesus-believing community as a church. There was not yet a church in the sort of institutionalized sense that we kind of think about them. Most Jesus believers met in houses that were owned by Jesus believers, some of the more wealthy Jesus believers. So we know the early Jesus believing groups were being established from the time of Jesus's ministry through Paul's time of Paul's work. And then we also know that there was a significant Jewish uprising in the around 66 BCE and 70 BCE. And that, when there was also some internal struggle, which I don't know much about, in the Roman Empire, that ended when the Roman Empire, under the leadership at this point of the Emperor Vespasian, basically destroyed Jerusalem, the sort of home city of the Jews, and in particular destroyed the temple, which was this sort of cultural center of Jewish life. The temple had been destroyed and rebuilt at other times, but it's always a traumatic moment, and by other empires who variously ruled over the Jews of the Middle East. But it's always a traumatic event, and this was a very traumatic event for Jews at the time. It plays a role. One of the reasons we know that Matthew is written after 70 CE is that the destruction of the temple appears to play a role in some of Matthew's accounts of what happens, and that's something we'll also get into a little bit. So I wanted to give you this picture of what was going on in the Roman Empire and what was going on in terms of the composition of the text that would end up being much later in the New Testament. And here we come to a very powerful coming together of what we think of as religion and what the Romans thought of as politics, and that is the practice of crucifixion. Crucifixion was relatively common, as I understand it, means of punishment in the Roman world. You may have remembered that from Professor Verhilly's talk that Roman citizens were protected from crucifixion. They apparently couldn't be crucified. This is an account of what happened to a number of the rebel fighters in Jerusalem when at the end of the Jewish wars that we were talking about before in 70, after the Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed as well. This is an account from a guy named Josephus, a Jewish intellectual who kind of well, you'll see, who's sympathetic to both sides of the fight. He had started out as a rebel and kind of gone over to the Roman imperial side. He's talking about soldiers fighting on the Jewish side or the Judean side. When they were going to be taken, they were forced to defend themselves for fear of being punished, as after they had fought, they thought it too late to make any supplication for mercy. So they were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were then crucified before the walls of the city. This miserable procedure made Titus greatly to pity them. Well, they caught every day 500 Jews, nay, some days they caught more, yet it did not appear to be safe for him to let those that were taken by force go their way, and to set a guard over so many he saw would be to make such as great deal them useless to him, a great deal of them useless to him. The main reason why he did not forbid that cruelty was this, that he hoped the Jews might perhaps yield at that sight, out of fear lest they might themselves afterwards be liable to the same cruel treatment. So the soldiers, out of the wrath and hatred they bore the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after the other, and another after another, to the crosses, by way of jest, when their multitude was so great that room was wanting for the crosses, and crosses wanting for the bodies. So this gives a picture of how unbelievably cruel the Roman forces found it necessary to be in response to this uprising. Titus, the Titus mentioned here, was at the time a military commander who Josephus is deliberately presenting as relatively sympathetic, as if this is something he really regretted. He became emperor after Vespasian. Meanwhile, there was increasingly an effort to link the emperor to divinity, as I've mentioned before, as a kind of warrant or reason that the emperor should rule. So to give an example of that, this is a temple of Augustus and Roma, which is in Ankara, which is pretty far to the east, not as far as Antioch, where Matthew was, but pretty far to the east, pretty far away from Rome. This was built in 25 BCE, and as you can see, is in a temple to both Augustus and to a goddess, Roma, the goddess who represented Rome. It had inscribed on its walls a text known as the Deeds of the Divine Augustus, which obviously made Augustus sound like a divine figure. So this is an image of a building that was out there in the colonies, right, far away from Rome, and these colonized places that were meant to set the empire and the emperor up as a godlike figure. This temple is associated with both a god and Augustus himself. So then, in this context, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, when you run into a passage like this, here's Jesus again. Jesus says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as ransom for many." So we go from this picture of a sort of deity-like ruler who exercises his power in the cruelest possible way and erects these immense temples to himself. Um, and then, on the other hand, you get a model of both leadership and divinity, which here is being presented as a direct alternative, right? This is the way the rulers of the Gentiles do it, but we're going to do it otherwise. Um, and this is another model of power, a much different model of power, and one that may be rooted very strongly in Jewish apocalyptic tradition that um, saw the universe as a result of the relationship between God and his chosen people, tending toward a moment when justice would arrive in a violent, or maybe violent, maybe not, but decisive moment. And Jesus, as we'll see as we move into the second part of this discussion, uh, Matthew is really working to situate Jesus in a what's called a salvation trajectory, um, as part of the overarching Jewish story of an apocalyptic end of time that would produce justice and would produce these kinds of reversals of power that are so central to what Jesus says in Matthew.